Good afternoon. This is Ted Warner with the Texas Library Association, welcoming you to Introduction to Drupal, Part 1 of 3. Today we'll be covering installation, basic configuration, content types, and user roles with our instructor, Rain Michaels. She is the principal trainer with the Cherry Hill Company in Los Angeles, and she's been building websites since about 1998. She's an active member of the Drupal community and a well-known trainer. She's taught web development at colleges and universities all across the country, and she has also presented at DrupalCons, Drupal camps, and user groups. Her company, the Cherry Hill Company, provides integration development and consulting services, specializing in innovative and efficient web solutions for libraries, government, and universities. Welcome, Rain. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ted. Well, let's dive right in. Introduction to Drupal. So the first question that people ask when talking about Drupal is, what is Drupal? And people typically answer Drupal is a content management system or a content management framework. And it's actually a lot more than that. It does create, it's a set of code written mostly in PHP that creates a very robust system that includes a content management system. It also is something of a web application framework. I like to say, if you can imagine it, you can probably build it with Drupal. But Drupal is also a community, and that's really important. Drupal is open source, which means that the software itself, the set of code, is free and open to anyone who'd like to use it. However, even though it is free, in a way, it's not entirely free because it's part of being a Drupal user is being part of the Drupal community. So your kind of payment for using Drupal, hopefully, and it's an optional payment, it's a donation in a way, is that you'll become part of the community and get involved. You'll contribute what you learn back to the community, which might just be in presenting at Drupal camps, or it might be adding to documentation, or it might even be contributing things that you've built. It's not required, so it is free, but it's what makes Drupal amazing because people contribute all kinds of things, and people have amazing imaginations across the world. So the modules that have been developed for Drupal are pretty phenomenal and all-encompassing. So it's free, it's open source. You can use it however you'd like. You can build new applications out of it and then put those applications back into the world. It's also entirely customizable. If you have the time, the resources, and the talent to write code that does whatever comes to your mind, then you can customize your Drupal installation to make that happen. As such, it's also extremely powerful. And this is a really important aspect of Drupal. If you're diving into Drupal for the first time and you're excited that you're going to have a content management system of your own, a site where it'll be easy for you to add content to engage with your library patrons, it's really important to understand that the power behind Drupal does make it a little bit more complex than other systems that you might choose to use. One that's commonly compared with Drupal would be WordPress. And WordPress is amazing, but it's also limited in what you can do to customize it as an individual. Whereas Drupal, you pull up the hood, you get in there, you tear it apart, you put it back together, and you have something completely new. And that is pretty amazing. Drupal does have some requirements. It has perhaps more requirements than some other choices that you might make, only because it is so powerful. In order to work with a Drupal site, you need to have a web server. Or you need to not necessarily have a web server, but you need to have what's called an AMP stack, Apache, PHP, MySQL, or something equivalent to that in order to install it on your system. The reason why you need this is you're going to need the web server running. You're going to need Apache. Nginx is an option. Microsoft IIS is also an option, although typically people will use Apache or Nginx to work with a Drupal site. You're also going to need a database. And the databases that are preferred for Drupal sites will include MySQL, which is a very common one. And then I've included on the slide the numbers of those particular of the particular database options that you have. And the plus just means something higher than that. And you're also going to need PHP on your system. Right now, the required version of PHP is PHP 5.2.5 or higher. However, it's highly recommended that you work with PHP 5.3 or higher because newer versions of Drupal are depending on 5.3 and will continue to depend on higher versions of PHP. You're also going to need some disk space. Now, how much disk space you need, that's really up to you. What kind of a site are you building? Is your site going to have beautiful large images? If it is, then you're probably going to need a lot of disk space. Are you sharing videos? Then you're probably going to need disk space or some kind of a CDN for delivering your content. If you're just doing a very simple Drupal install, you don't have a lot going on, then you could get away with, a few hundred megs of disk space. In fact, you could even get away with, I believe the minimum requirement is 16 megs. So you don't need a lot of disk space for a Drupal install, but you do need a lot of disk space depending on what type of site you're building. And that would be true whether you were using Drupal or another system of your choosing. Installation options for a Drupal site. I put this in here because when you're going to build a Drupal site, you're going to need a web server, and typically people will have somebody set up a web server for them. Or you might go to one of the cheap web hosts that are out there and use their one-click install and have a Drupal site set up, and that's completely fine. However, as a library, you're going to want to work on your site in an iterative manner. You're going to want to learn how to get the most out of your site, and you're going to be experimenting. So you're not only going to want to have your production site in some kind of hosted environment where it can run, you're also going to want to have your website locally hosted. And what that means is that your computer, whatever your workstation is, has some kind of AMP stack on it that you can then use to work with and test your Drupal site. So the options for this, there are links for these options on the, I have a page up that you'll see the URL for at the end of the presentation, has all of the links to all of the resources. So links to these options where you can learn more about them are available there. But your first option is a web host. Again, not the ideal option if you're experimenting because you'll want to have it on your own workstation, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, doesn't matter. You also have the option of going with a service that Acquia has provided. Acquia is a kind of the Drupal service provider if you were looking for a company that went with Drupal the way that WordPress goes with WordPress. Acquia is sort of that company. It's a good resource. They offer a lot of tools for people. They offer webinars, but they also offer this tool called Acquia Dev Desktop, which used to be called DAMP, D-A-M-P, which is Drupal, Apache, MySQL, PHP. So the Acquia Dev Desktop is something that you can download and then install it on your computer, and it will install the Apache, PHP, MySQL stack for you. It will also set up Drupal for you. So a pretty quick way to get going. Not necessarily as customizable if you're someone who likes to get into the guts and really take a look around, but a really good option if you just want to get started without spending a lot of time learning about web servers. Another really great option that's going to take a lot more in terms of a learning curve to get yourself set up would be a combination of a service called, or a setup called Drupal Pro with VirtualBox. And VirtualBox is, both of these are tools that you can download. The links to them are also going to be on the resource page. Other options if you want to set up kind of a web server on your local machine. If you're using a Mac, a very easy tool, and the one that I use, just because it is so straightforward and simple and easy to demonstrate with, is MAMP, and that's for Mac Apache MySQL PHP, so it's a MAMP stack. You'll hear the word LAMP stack thrown around as well. That means Linux, Apache, MySQL PHP. And then there's also Bitnami and Zen Desktop. And Bitnami and Zen Desktop are both platform independent, so you can use them no matter what system you're using for your computer. So we're going to take a look at what happens when you install Drupal. When you decide that you're going to set up a Drupal site, the first place that you're going to start is going to be on Drupal.org. I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a moment, and it'll take a bit while we transition. Okay, so now you should see my browser window, and this is the homepage of Drupal.org, which is where you will start if you're going to set up Drupal. And typically, you would start by clicking on this giant green button here that says Get Started with Drupal. That's typically where you'd start. And then that brings you to this page, which is, if it's your first time, you might not necessarily know which thing you should look at first. Maybe you're someone who really likes to read all of the documentation before you get started. And if you do, that's excellent, because there's good documentation here under step 3, including installation guides. The links to these are on the resource list that is provided at the end of this presentation. So the installation guide can be very helpful. But the key place that you're going to start is also with this big green button, Download Drupal. And this is moving you towards the current release of Drupal. You may be hearing about Drupal 8 in wherever you're going, whatever events you're attending that speak about Drupal. Drupal 8 is a hot topic. But the truth is we don't know when Drupal 8 is going to come out, whether it'll be in January or March or even later in 2014. So right now the best choice is Drupal 7. That's the current version. And that is what this download link will always give you. Everything that we discussed today for Drupal 7 is relevant to Drupal 8. The buttons might be slightly different, the locations might be slightly different, but the configuration, the general basic tools are the same. So once you download Drupal 8, that's going to move you over to looking at your file system. So you're going to download a zip file, and then you're going to need to move the content of that zip file into your root directory for your hosted environment. So in this case, I have 2 different demos. One is already set up, which is the D7 demo, so I have Drupal 7 in there. And then I have Drupal 7 in D7 raw, and this is untouched for the purposes of this presentation. We're going to go through all the steps together. And you'll see all of these files in here. Now these files come from the zip file that I get when I download Drupal 7, which is right here. So this zip file, I unpack it, and then I get access to all of these files listed right here. So I just move them basically into my root directory. My local hosting environment, which is MAMP, is looking at this particular directory right now. So that's my root for this site. You'll also notice these 2 files right here that have dots in front of them, and they're grayed out. If you're looking at your list of files in your typical UI for your operating system, whether you're using Windows or Mac, doesn't really matter, you're not going to see the invisible files. Invisible files are files that have the dot in front of them. But these files do need to move with the entire set of files, especially the htaccess file. Without the htaccess file, your Drupal site will not work. So it's important to learn how to make sure that in your operating system, you're able to see your invisible files. In this case, I'm using a Mac, and I'm using an application called Pathfinder as my finder, or my Windows Explorer equivalent. And this shows me everything that I need to see. So once I have my files in here, the next step is just to go to the browser and point to the location of my site. So whether I'm setting it up using a web host, a local web host like MAMP, or using a hosting service that either someone has provided for me or that I go to a cheap web host to work with, there's a place that I can go, a URL that I can go to, or an IP address that I can go to that will point me to this directory through the browser. So that's what I need to do now, is go to that. And that's going to be in here. And what will happen when I do that is I will get to this screen, hopefully. If I don't, then I need to check and make sure that my .htaccess file is in my directory as well. So I'll just go to the URL. I don't need to put install.php into the URL. I go to whatever the URL is that I need to access for the site, and it redirects me to install.php because it doesn't see anything in existence yet. And I also want to point out, before I run through this install, that I've already set up a database. This is a tool that I use called Navicat, and it helps me manage all of my databases. You can see here on this list that on my local environment, this is my local setup here, I have a lot of databases. So I use a tool to help me. If you're only working with one site, phpMyAdmin is perfectly acceptable. So this is the database right here that I have set up for this site. I also have the demo site that I mentioned, which is already running. And let's just pop over to that so that you can see the demo site. And I believe that's going to be right here. So I have a demo site already running, and this is basically what we're going to build. And that demo site is using this database right here, TLA_D7 demo. You'll see that it has a lot of tables in it, whereas the one that's raw, which is the one that we're about to build, doesn't have anything in it at this time. So moving back over to that installation, I'm going to go with a standard install because perhaps I'm new to Drupal and I just want to get started with the basic setup. If you really know what you're doing, then you might start with minimal, but in this case, you're going to be starting with the standard install. So I'll save and continue. Now it's going to walk me through the process. Drupal 7 starts with English, and that's the only option at the beginning with the basic install package. Drupal 8 is going to actually make it possible for you to start your install with a lot of different languages. And with Drupal 7, you can change the language if you want to, but you need to do some work. So we're going to start with English. Now I get to this page and I can't proceed. It's giving me 2 error messages, and it makes them very visible, so that's really good. And it gives me a lot of information. So the key information that I'm getting here is I need a file system. And I don't have a file system by default, if we go back to Pathfinder here, because this right here, while it looks like a file system, and it is technically a file system, this is the file system for the site files, the files that run the code or contain the code that the site needs to use. And it's really not a good idea to ever mess with these files. You're never going to touch them. So there's one directory here called sites. And this one directory, this is your directory. This is your playground where you get to put things. There's an all directory in here where you can put modules and themes, and we'll talk about that later. And then there's a default directory in here. And default, typically, there are exceptions if you're doing multi-site or something else, but typically default is where your temporal files for your site are going to live. Temporal files might be your images that you upload when you create content on your site, or maybe you have a particular piece of content to which you attach a PDF. That PDF would be a temporal file, and it needs a place to go because it's not part of the code that's running the site. It's just a file that needs to be provided with the site. So this is being really nice to me. It's telling me exactly where it's expecting to see that file system before I continue with the install. So I'm going to go to Sites Default, and I'm going to create a folder called Files. So I'm in Sites, and I'm in Default. And now I'm just going to do New Folder, I'll call it files and double check to make sure that there's no typo in there. Now I have this directory. The next thing that I'm being told here is that my settings.php file doesn't exist. And it's telling me very kindly exactly what I need to do to make that settings.php file exist. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by duplicating default.settings.php and then renaming it settings.php. And now I'm just going to reload this page to try to continue, and it should give me new errors. And excellent, it did. So notice that this no longer says that the files directory doesn't exist. Now it tells me that the files directory isn't writable. And the same thing, it tells me the same thing, that the settings file is not writable. So I'm going to do something really bad here, which is not bad right now because I just need to get the site set up. I'm going to get info on the files directory, and whatever operating system you're using will have its way of getting info. And then I'm going to change this to be fully writable. So this is just the quick way of doing it for demonstration purposes. So I'm changing it to be fully writable. You'll see down here 777 is the number that this now has. So I'm going to close that. And then I'm going to change the settings.php file the same way. I'm going to make it fully writable. And now I should be able to continue with the installation. There it is. I just reloaded the installer and now it's letting me continue. So now I need to move forward and add that database information that we looked at earlier. So I had set up a database, or on your host, maybe somebody's already set up a database for you. You'll need to know the name of the database, the username, and the password. And the username and password needs to be a fully privileged user for that database so that the Drupal site can write to the database whenever you're creating content. So the database is raw. And then the username, I just did the simple way. You'll want something more sophisticated. So I'll enter my username and password. Typically, you can skip advanced options unless your web host or whoever set up your database for you tells you that there's a table prefix. This is a very common one with some of the cheap web hosts, that there will be a table prefix. But typically, you should be able to ignore advanced options, especially if you're working locally. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and it's going to install Drupal. We'll give it a moment. All right, so now Drupal's installed. It's giving me a very helpful warning message up here saying that all the necessary changes have been made to site's default and site's default settings.php, and that I should remove write permissions to them in order to avoid security risks. This is very true because at this time now, your settings.php file is what tells the site what database to look at and work with whenever somebody hits the site or whenever you're working with content. That's a fully privileged database user, and the username and password for that database are stored in that settings.php file. Also, if you leave your files directory, that site's default files directory, open to anyone to write to, you are potentially creating a risk where somebody could set up some kind of cross-site scripting or something if they can actually figure out how to get in there if they have write access. So it's very important that you change permissions. And there's a lot of good information about permissions on Drupal.org, and a slide that I'll show you in a couple minutes also has some of that information as to what those permissions should be for you. So we have two sites right now that we're working with. This is the demo site, the one that I already set up. And then this is the brand new raw site that we're going to set up together. The first line that it gives me right here is site name. And site name is going to translate into what you see right here, Introduction to Drupal demo site. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. And Introduction to Drupal And I'm just going to call this live demo because it needs to have a slightly different name. Site email address. This is important for you because this is the email address that any email sent by the site to anyone is going to use. And it tells you here, for example, registration information, or somebody forgets their password and asks for a password reset. This is the from email that this will come from. So I'm just going to put in my email address. This is not what you would typically want to do because this email address is one that could potentially be open to getting spam because it's very significant published email address. So don't use your own email address the way that I am for the purposes of this demo. Then there's also this field here that says site maintenance account. This is an account. This is what's called user one. We're going to talk about user one later on in the webinar. User one, however, has full privileges to everything on the site. So this is a very important account. You do not ever want to lose the password for this account. If you do, you can reset the password as long as the email address is something real. And the other thing for security reasons is the username should probably not be admin because that's what a hacker might expect it to be. So you'll want to come up with a different username for your user one account. So I'm just going to be bad and use Rain because I'm the only person who's ever going to use this site. But again, that's an easy one for a hacker to guess, so it's not one that I would actually use on a real site. And I'm going to leave the email address as the site email address. Now I need to create a secure password. And this is really important that you follow the suggestions here, and 6 characters is actually not enough. I would say at least 8, preferably something more like 12 to 14. Again, this is a very important account that you're creating here, but you want to make sure that you will remember this password because you're going to need it later. So I'm going to put in a password that I know that I'll remember, and that gives me a strong setting. The next things, well, I'm in Los Angeles, so the default to Los Angeles is great. And I'm going to set this to United States for the country. Time zone is important on your site as soon as you start getting into publishing things like events. If you're going to have events on your site, or if you're going to have anything that is date sensitive, make sure that your time zone is set before you start adding that kind of content. Otherwise, you could end up with weird results when people are looking at those date sensitive pieces of content on your site because they might be in a different time zone from you from where that content was added or the content of the particular of the site default. The next thing that I'm going to do is for my own peace of mind, but I don't recommend that you do this. I'm unchecking check for updates automatically and receive email notifications. The only reason why I'm unchecking these right now is because this is a demo site that I'm creating and I don't want to get a bunch of emails from this if I forget to turn off this site after the webinar because I'm going to be keeping it on for future webinars. So I don't want to get a bunch of emails from my site saying that there's updates. You, however, will want to know when there are security updates for your site. So you'll want it to check for updates automatically, typically, and you'll want to receive email notifications, typically. There are always exceptions to every rule. And if you're working with a lot of sites or you have your own maintenance plan that you work with, you might not want to check for updates automatically or receive the notifications. And I'm going to save and continue. And now I have a Drupal site. That is the extent of the installation. So I'm going to go ahead and visit this site. It knows the name that I gave it, and I'm logged in right now as that user one, and I have full access to do whatever I want to with the site. And that's the install. The install is honestly the most difficult part if you're just starting with Drupal. If you've been using Drupal for a while, the install might be fairly straightforward. But once you get past this, it's really a lot of fun from here, and this is what usually trips people up. So now bear with me, we're going to head back over to the PowerPoint. And I think it's going to take a moment to load. And give it a second, and then we're great. It started me where we were before, so this is excellent. All right. So common installation gotchas. We discussed some of these on the when I went through the installation, but I want to go through them again really quickly here and point to this slide because this is a slide that you might want to come back to when you're getting started. For me, when I first started with Drupal was in, I think it was in 2007, the installation part was so overwhelming that I didn't think I would get past it. And once I finally figured it out, Drupal was exciting. But if you get into this place where you're trying to install Drupal and it's frustrating and it's not working right, don't worry, you're not alone. And if you can get to a local user meetup, a user group meetup, then somebody there can probably help you get going. There's videos online, there's the installation guides that are linked to from the resources for the webinar. So just power through, get past the installation, and then you can start having fun. But the common gotchas, the things that I've seen most people who get stuck, and the things that I got stuck on, are going to be your files aren't writable. So check that site's default files directory that we looked at and make sure that your permissions are allowing your website to write to the files directory. Settings.php doesn't exist, so making sure that that does exist and making sure that it's writable so that you can actually go through the installation process. Very important. A blank white screen. This is probably the most terrifying thing that you'll see. And it is common with a Drupal site. Drupal is resource intensive. It does require a decent amount of memory to run. And the white screen usually means you don't have enough memory. Or you might have plenty of memory on your system, but not enough of it is PHP isn't allowing the use of enough of it for your site. So if that's the case and you're working with a web host or somebody's providing you hosting space, then you'll want to ask them to give you more memory in your php.ini file. And that's going to be at minimum 128 would be good, 128 megs. Some people like to go a lot higher, but if the least amount of memory that you can get away with for your site to run well is what you want to use. You don't want to use more memory than you actually need. And if you are working locally, then look at your help files. If you're using MAMP or if you're using Zen Desktop or something else, look at your help files for that tool to figure out how to add more memory to your PHP so that you can actually see the site. And that will usually fix it. Not being able to access any page except for the home page of your site is also a very common issue. And usually, probably 99 times out of 100, the reason is because you're missing the .htaccess file. I mentioned those invisible files that are very important that need to be in your Drupal root directory at the beginning of looking at the installation. And one of those is .htaccess. So it's invisible in your file system unless you have something that's allowing you to see invisible files. So you'll just need to make sure that file exists and that it's not corrupted. And then you should be able to get to the interior pages of your site. There are other reasons that that can happen. One of them is clean URLs, but they're a little bit more rare. If that does happen, then you'll need to do more investigation to figure out what's going on. Database access. Every tool that you might use to have a local system, a local web server, has a different way of dealing with databases. Whoever's setting up your hosting for you, or you, if you do your own hosting, might have a unique way of setting up your databases. Or if you're using a service like Bluehost or Media Temple has, I think they require table prefixes on all of their databases. So check all of the help documentation to make sure that you have the right location and information for your database. Otherwise, you won't necessarily get database access. So these are common, These aren't necessarily the only things that can go wrong, and these aren't necessarily the only reasons why anything that's listed here could be difficult to work through. But these are the most common ones and will typically get you out of trouble. I also mentioned that once you finish the install, you don't want to keep your site's default files directory and your settings.php directory as fully writable 777 because that's really bad for security reasons. It could open up your site to pretty much anything. So your settings.php file is going to need to be executable but not readable. You don't want somebody to come in and read that file who doesn't have permission, but it needs to be executable so that the Drupal site can actually make use of the information that's in the settings.php file, find the database, and then get to all the content. Your files directory, you're going to want it to be fully executable, writable, readable by your web server, by your website, the user that your website uses. Otherwise, you need it to be you need it to be readable and executable, but you don't want it to be writable by anyone except those who except for your web server, basically. And that's pretty much it. So those are the permissions that you're going to want. All right, once you have your Drupal site set up, now we can get into configure. You have it, it exists, but it doesn't really do anything that you want it to do. So now we can take the next step and actually take a look at configuration. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a moment, and we're going to head back over to the demo. Bear with me here. All right. So we have this new site that we've created. I'm logged in as user 1, and I want to show you how I know that I'm logged in. I know that I'm logged in as user 1 because that's the name that's up here, which is Rain, which is the name that I gave to user 1. But if I go over to a different browser, I'm now using Firefox. A moment ago I was using Chrome. And I don't want to go to install.php. I'm just going to load the page. If I'm seeing the site not logged in, I see a username and password field, and I don't see that black bar up at the top. But if I head back over to Chrome here where I am authenticated, I'm logged in, I'm going to see this black bar up at the top that's going to help me with configuration. And I no longer see the login block, but I do see this navigation add content block here. So this tells me that I'm logged in. And when I'm logged in, now I can go ahead and work with the site. So I'm going to start with just basic configuration. We've put in a site email address already when we did the installation, and we've put in a name for the site, which is Introduction to Drupal Live Demo. But if I go up here under and onto this black bar that I'm running my mouse over quickly right now to make it very visually obvious, there's an option here that says configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and we're going to take a look at what's in there. And it's going to take a moment. All right. So, and this is good actually. I'm being told that there are problems with my Drupal installation. And so I have that warning message. We'll take a look at that warning message in a few moments. But before we do that, we're just going to take a look at what's in here. So under configuration, there are tools for me to manage people. These are users that might log into the site or people that might visit the site, and anyone who might visit the site. There are tools to manage the system, which includes site information, which is what we're interested in right now. And then other tools, content authoring. There's this thing called text formats that I can work with. And then there's some other tools in here. And this is something that you'll want to explore when you're working with your site. There's also down here regional and language, and we're going to look at that right now as well. But we're going to start up at the top with site information. So I'm going to click on that. And it's giving me site name, which I already filled in. I can edit it here if I'd like. So if I don't like what I put in the installation, that's totally fine. And then I can add a slogan. And I'll just type in slogan right there. I can change the site email address. And then there's some other options here regarding the front page, which we'll talk about later on in one of the later webinars, probably webinar 2. But for now, this is what I'm going to look at, and then I'm going to save this. And it tells me configuration options have been saved. And then I can go ahead and close this overlay and notice that now I have that slogan right here. So I've adjusted my site information. This is kind of the main information for from a search engine's perspective. This is the kind of overarching metadata of the site. The next thing I want to look at is the regional information. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to look at regional settings. And this is where I can make sure that the country is correct or fix it if it's not, that the time zone is correct or fix it if it's not. And then this is an important one. Users may set their own time zone. As a physical library, if that is where you work, you probably don't want people to do that because you want everything on your site to be indicating the time zone that the library itself is physically in. So for most people viewing this webinar, this is a setting that you want to disable pretty early on because time zone is one of those tricky things that can make something more difficult later on, or at least give you confusing information later on. If you do want people to be able to use their own time zone, then you have a much more complex site that you're building. So there's a lot more that you'll be learning about time zones, and then you might allow this. But for most people viewing this, you'll want to turn off users may set their own time zone, and you'll want to do that right away. And then save that configuration. So those are very, very basic configuration. Not a lot that you did there, but it does show you how immediate these changes can be on your site. There are some other tools here in this menu, and we're just going to flip through them really quickly. Dashboard is an interesting one that's going to help you with your content. Some people find Dashboard very helpful. Some people create more sophisticated content management environment in their Drupal site and they customize a lot. So that's going to be up to you. But this tool, as you start adding content, will be useful. Then there's a content tab, which allows you to get into your content and add content. Structure tab is where we're going to be spending a lot of time in all 3 of these webinars. Today, we're going to be spending time under content types. And then in the next webinars, we'll be looking at blocks, menus, and taxonomy. Appearance is where you can change your theme. You can actually get new themes from Drupal.org or some of the other services that are out there, and we will talk about that in the last of the 3 webinars. People we're going to talk about at the end of today's webinar. Modules we're also going to be spending some time in today. So it's very nice to kind of flip through these and take a look at what these tabs have to offer. Now, occasionally when we have been opening up some of these overlays here, this is called an overlay. Notice that you can see the site peeking underneath it. We've been getting a little error message that says that there's something wrong with the Drupal installation. So I'm going to go to reports so that I can find out what's wrong. And most importantly here, I'm going to go to status report. And status report will tell me what's wrong with my site. And what it's telling me is that my configuration file, settings.php, is not protected, and so there's a security risk for the site. So that's what's wrong. Everything else is green, and I don't need to worry about everything else. But the configuration file I do need to worry about, although we're going to ignore it for the purposes of this demo. And now we're going to move on to content types. Bear with me while I bring back up the PowerPoint. All right, so moving on to content types. First of all, content types, when you install a Drupal site, you have two content types by default. And we'll look at these two content types when we get to the demo, but I don't want to kind of move you back and forth between this and the demo too often. So your Drupal install, it'll come with two. It'll come with basic page and it'll come with article. Article is kind of your typical blog post, if you might imagine a blog post, or if it's a magazine site, you know, a news article. Article is a very good word for this. It's kind of temporal content that's happening in the moment and provides some kind of a story or information. So the article content type has more in it than the basic page content type. Your basic page content type is your evergreen content, being you know, the About Us page, or the Friends of the Library page, or the, you know, the landing page of the teens section or the young adult section of your website. These are kind of key sections on your site that don't change very often necessarily. Maybe some of the pieces on them change, but those are probably going to be coming in using what we call views, which brings other content into another piece of content or another display. And we'll be looking at views in the third webinar. So by default, your basic page, pretty simple, doesn't have a lot going on, and it does allow for the user to very easily put a basic page into the menu system. So the navigation that somebody might use to actually click through the site, it has a title and then it has basic body text, so not much. Your article content type, however, it'll have the title, it'll have the body text, but everything else is different. Up at the top here, if you can see this in the slideshow, is submitted by information. So it has submitted by rain on the 11th. And then it has the timestamp of when it was submitted. So first of all, that's a huge difference between the basic page, your evergreen content, which isn't going to be necessarily stamped with a date, and an article content, which has a date stamp on it. It says this is when this content is from, making it relevant to a particular date and time. It's also by default going to have an image. So you'll see the image here that's been added to this sample piece of content. And it's also by default going to have tags. So they're very small here. We'll look at this in more detail when we move back over to the demo to see the tags. But these are basically terms that mark your content. So if you want to mark content that's for young adults and then make it very easy to somebody to click on a little link here and get to all young adult content, this is a way for you to do that. It allows you to provide metadata on your temporal content. And then by default, the article content type also allows for comments, which are not allowed on the basic page. And it does not allow the content to go into a menu, because typically a temporal piece of content isn't going to belong in your main navigation. It's not going to have the longevity that your evergreen content will have. So we're going to look at the two default content types, which we just discussed, and I'm going to show those to you in the demo. And then we're going to create a new content type, which is an event content type. The event content type is going to use a lot of the same stuff that the other two content types have. It's going to have a title, it's going to have body text, it'll have an image, it'll have tags. It will not show submitted by information, and it will not be part of a menu. It's also going to have some other things that aren't part of the other content types. It's going to have a contact field, and then it's going to have a date, because events, you need to know when they're going to happen. And it's going to have a registration link field where you can put a link to, say, an Eventbrite page or somewhere else so that people can register. And then it's going to have a location if we have enough time on this webinar. Otherwise, the location will come in later. So we're going to head over back to the demo, and we're going to take a look at that. So bear with me while I switch over. All right. So taking a look at the demo site that's already been set up, we're going to look at two different pieces of content. the About Us content, this is a basic page. So it just has a title and it has a bunch of text. And that's all it's got. The A Stack of Books piece of content, which is an article, this piece of content has the submitted by, it has this big photo, it has some text. Here's the tags. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more so that you can see those tags right here. And then it has the comments. And if I go to the home page, what I'll see is Stack of Books is on the home page. There's another article here, Coconuts Make Great Conversation Pieces. That's an earlier article. And these are showing up by default on the home page. I mentioned that there's an aspect of the site information configuration pane that we'll work on in a future webinar. And what you see here on the home page is actually what that piece is. The About Us page is in the menu. And if I go to the content page here using my menu up at the top, I have 4 pieces of content. I have that basic page, which is the About Us page. I have an event, which we're going to ignore for a moment. And then I have these 2 articles. So moving on over to our demo, we'll just quickly create. I'm going to use the content link here, and then I'm going to click Add Content, and I'm going to quickly create a basic page. I'll make it About Us to match the demo. And I'm going to grab some what we call lipsum or lorem ipsum, some generic pseudo-Latin looking text to make this look like something. Now I'm going to check off, there's these options here starting with menu settings. I'm going to check off provide a menu link, and I'm going to tell it that it needs to be in the main menu and that the link needs to say about instead of About Us. So the title of the page is About Us, and the link is going to say About. I'm going to ignore everything else for now and then click Save. Now I have this About page. Notice that it doesn't look like anything that you saw in the demo site, and that's okay. There are reasons for that, and we'll get to those in future webinars. And the tab is right here in the main menu. So there's 2 tabs in the main menu, Home and About. And there it is. If I go to Home, there's still no content on the home page, but now I'm going to go ahead and add a sample article. So I'll just call it sample article, just to be really interesting. And now I'm going to create 2 new tags. So I'll create demo and TLA webinar. So there's 2 tags. And we'll just add that same lipsum that we added earlier. Make it a little bit shorter. And I'm going to upload an image. And I'm going to add alt text. You will always want to add alt text to your images for accessibility reasons. Now I'm not going to put this into a menu. Right now by default it's actually allowing me to do that. When I set up sites for clients, when we work with libraries, for example, we make sure that this kind of content doesn't have this option visible, and that's very easy to change in your content type. But I'm going to leave everything else the same. I'm going to leave comment settings open. I don't need to. I can close them so that people can't post comments. And I'm going to make sure that this is published and promoted to front page. And we'll talk about those in a minute. And then save this. Now I come to the page where I'm actually seeing this article. This is called a node, just as the About page is a node. And that node is the About node. It's that one piece of content. You'll see up here in the URL that it says node 1. So it's the first node that I created. If I go back home and go to sample article, it says node 2. It's the second node that I created. And if I go back to the home page, notice that it displays the article differently from how it displayed on the node page. Now if I want to create a new content type, an event content type, I'm going to do that under structure. And then I'm going to click on content types, and it shows me the 2 default content types. I can edit them from here. So if I don't want article to allow me to access the menu, I would click on edit article, and then under menu settings, I would uncheck main menu and then save that content type. And now if somebody tries to create an article, they won't get the option to add it to a menu. So that won't even be visible to them. So creating a new content type, I'm going to add content type, and I'm going to call it an event. I can add some help information. Requires a date. And then now I have these other options that I need to choose. By default, do I want the content to be published or promoted to the front page? I'm going to check off no on promoted to the front page because I don't want it to show necessarily in that river of news, or I want to control. This doesn't mean that a user adding a piece of content can't promote it themselves, but it does mean that it won't be that way by default. I'll leave this published, although this is an interesting one as well. If content is published, then the end user can see it. So somebody who's not logged into your site comes to visit your site, they can see all published content. They cannot see unpublished content. So if you create a piece of content and uncheck published under the publishing options, then it's unpublished for that time. You can continue to work on it and know that nobody who isn't allowed to see that and work with that content will ever see it until you change it to published. I'm also going to say on the event content type, I don't want the submitted by information, the date and time of the and author of the node. I don't want that displayed because the only time that's important for an event content is the time of the event itself. So I'm going to uncheck that. And I don't want people commenting on events. So I'm going to hide that entirely so that there's no comment form available. I also don't want events going into the main menu because they're not evergreen content. They need to be displayed to people in other ways, not as main menu content. So that's the initial setup that I'm going to provide for my event content type. From here, I now have this tool here. It shows me all of the content types, and on the event content type, I can edit, I can manage fields, and I can manage display. So I'm going to go ahead and manage fields. And we talked about some of the content, some of the things that need to be in the event content type. We're going to work on those things that don't require anything special first. So we know that it needs to have an image, and we know that the image field already exists because the article content type has it. So I'm just going to add that as an existing field. I know the image field exists. I'll just use that and then click Save. I'll leave all of the settings the same as their default except one, which is enable alt text. Again, your images should always have alt text. Alt text is for screen readers and it's also for search engines. So it's very important. So that's the only setting I'm going to change for now. The next thing I'm going to add is another existing field, which is tags, because I want to be able to tag this content as well. And then I'll save that. So now if I go to add content, and I'm going to open that in a new tab and head over to event, I have this form that asks for a title and a body. So we'll just put Ellipsum in there. An image, so I can add an image, and some tags. So we'll call this young adult and demo. And it's suggesting to me tags that already exist based on what I type. And that's all I'm going to do for now. So now we'll have a piece of event content. Notice how it displays. It's really not a good display, and we're going to fix that shortly. So from there, now I know that I have the tags. I'll go ahead and save this default setting for the tags. I have the image, I have the body, and I have the title. Now the other thing that I need that doesn't require a module is a contact information for the event. So some kind of event contact if somebody has questions. So I'm going to type that in and create this as a new field. Notice that there used to be this add existing field option here, and it's not there anymore. And the reason it's not there is because I've already added all of the existing fields to this event. So there are no existing fields for me to choose from anymore. So now I'm creating a brand new field, and I'm going to make it text. I'm going to make it long text because I want people to be able to put multiple lines in. If there's a mailing address or something that I want to add, that'll just make it more helpful. So it's text area, multiple rows, and I'll save that. Now it needs me to set the field settings for this particular field, and I can decide if I want it to be required. I can add help text, which this right here is help text on a field. And I can say whether or not people can add basic HTML or what they can do with the particular piece of, what they can do with the particular field. I can also put in default information. So if there's somebody who is usually the event contact, I can make that the default information so that people only have to edit the field. They don't have to actually re-add that information. Then I can save the settings. Now if I go back to the sample event and edit it and scroll down, now there's a field here. You know, so I can just add that information and then save it. Now if I scroll down, the event contact information is here. The reason why I added that contact information as 2 lines, and you're seeing it here as 1, is because my field settings tell this to be plain text as opposed to filtered HTML. So it removes any unwanted characters, which includes a breaking space. So, so that character return that I did. So now I have these existing fields, but I know that I need some other fields, and the key field I need is the date field. And that might be all that we have time for on the webinar, but all of the other content, all of the other modules work the same way as the one that we're going to demonstrate here. So we're going to make sure that we can add a date field. Now in order to do that, we need a module, because if I look here, type of data to store, and I look at the optionals, the options that are available, there are some options that are number based. The float, decimal, these are number options, but none of them say date. And I really want to be able to work with this content when I start creating views, which we'll do in the 3rd webinar. I want to make sure that I can display, the upcoming webinar and have it choose what the upcoming webinar is by date, or have it no longer show past webinars by date. So it needs to be the date, not a random number that's in there, and the system needs to know that it's a date. So I need a module. The module that I need is the date module. So we're going to head back over to the slideshow. Bear with me for a moment on this. And share document. Great. Okay, so we just looked at the content types. Now we're in the event content type. We have these three fields here that are going to require modules before we continue. So now we're going to need to extend the functionality of our Drupal site with modules. There are thousands of modules available for Drupal, and not all of these modules are good. So the important thing is to learn how to figure out which modules are good and how to choose the modules that you need for your site. So the first part of doing that is recognizing the way that the module pages are set up, that the project pages are set up on Drupal.org. So you'll be able to get modules from Drupal.org. You can simply go to Drupal.org. There's a search field. You type in what you're looking for. You want a fancy slideshow, or you want a date, or you want a calendar. You type that in, and it'll give you a ton of results. Whether or not those results are what you're looking for, that's up to you. The key trick to identifying whether or not a module is one that you want to work with is to read through the module page. The date one is a very good one because this is a very old module that has a lot of work on it. It's used by a lot of people. It's very essential to a lot of people. So this particular page has a lot on it. So the first thing to look at when you're looking at a module on Drupal.org is the module description, which is really the bulk of the page. It's going to be your module description. So you'll read through it, you'll make sure that what it says it does is what you're actually looking for. If it's not, then underneath the development column on the picture that's shown here on this slide, underneath the resources and development, there's usually another thing that says related modules. And you can use that to see if there's another module that's similar that might do what you want specifically. Because if you can find a module that does what you want, then you don't need to write your own module. If you don't, then you're going to need to write your own module and have it do what you want. So you're going to look at the description and make sure, is it clear what this module is doing? And is it well documented? There are usually documentation links right off the module description, and if it's well documented, that's excellent. That means the maintainers are very active. It means that if you have a problem, you're much more likely to find somebody who's going to be able to help you with that problem, and that the module is well cared for. The second thing that you'll want to look at is the age of the module. When was the module first posted? In this case, it was posted in 2006. This module has been tried and true and existed for quite a long time. There are new modules that are great. People are posting modules daily. So if a module is new, it doesn't mean it's a bad module. It just means you might need to look at it a little bit more closely. You might be one of the beta testers for the module, and so you might need to participate in the issue queue if you find something that's not quite working right. If it's been up for a long time, then you're going to want to take a look at, well, how frequently is this kept up to date? Is this a module that was posted in 2006 and then hasn't been touched since 2007? If that's the case, this is not the module for you. But if it's being worked on, then it's probably a good module and can be used for what you want. The issue queue. So this is item number 3 as marked on the slide. The issue queue will tell you how many people have posted issues with the module. These can be anything from questions to suggestions to finding actual bugs. It'll show you all the issues. You can search through it, maybe search for the type of thing that you're trying to do and see what gets returned. The number of open issues isn't necessarily an indication of something not being attended to. In this case, in the date module's case, there are over 1,000 open issues, but this is a highly maintained module, this very important module that a lot of people use, so very active. So the number of open issues isn't necessarily a warning sign. However, if there are 4,000 open issues and none have been addressed, they're all still open, that's definitely a potential warning sign. You also want to look at the maintainers. Who built this module? Are they still working on it? Or are they looking for a new maintainer? What's happening with the module? And that'll tell you a lot about whether or not you want to use it. Also, in selecting a module, you'll want to look at what's related to it. Do the related modules provide you with kind of the right recipe for the functionality that you're looking for? Project information, item 6, will tell you, is this under active development or has this been abandoned? Very important. Or is it looking for a new maintainer? If it's looking for a new maintainer and you want to take it on, very cool. And then finally, also very important, are the download options that are available at the end. This tells you when the download was released. You're going to want to try to use a recommended version rather than something that's a development release. If it's red, this means that it's not quite ready for you to use on a production site yet. People do use red modules on production sites. You just need to watch it more carefully, make sure that you check your error logs, and be ready to be up on your security updates in case something's found, and pay attention to the issue queue. So the module that we're going to install right now is going to be the date module. And I'm going to move back over to my screen. And Pathfinder here. All right, so we know that we are going to need the date module in order to add the date field to this content type. And I'm going to head back over to Pathfinder, and I have some modules here that I've already downloaded. So first you need to download it the same way that you would download Drupal. And then you're going to need to add it somewhere in your site. And the place that you're going to add it, everything that's unique to you is going to be under sites. Do not ever add it under the modules directory or add a theme under the themes directory here. Because when you do security updates for your site, whatever you've customized in those directories will go away. So your theme might go away, your modules might go away. Only do work in the sites directory. So under sites is this all directory, and in there is a modules and themes directory. Those two directories are where you're going to put your contributed or custom modules or themes that you create. So I'm going to go into modules here, and then I'm just going to grab all of these modules, even though we're not really going to use them all, and I'm going to copy them into there. And now if I go back to the browser under configuration, I'm sorry, not under configuration, under modules, and look at this modules list. This modules list is quite long, and it will include the module that I was interested in, really, even though I brought them all in, which is the date module. So if I scroll down here, or I'll do a find and I'll search for date, and it'll show me the date module information here, which I can enable. Now looking at this is kind of daunting, this list of modules, and not very easy to use. So we're going to start with installing another module, which I've already added over because I added all the modules at once, which is called module filter. This is just a helper module. So I'm going to search for that. Module filter, it's right here down at the end. I'm going to enable that just by checking it off and then saving configuration. And watch what happens to my modules page. Immediate improvement. Everything is organized, much easier for me to work with. This is how how instantly modules will impact your site and change the functionality on your site. So just a click, and now by choosing module filter, I have this much more friendly interface, which also gives me this date time tab. So I'll click on that, and then this shows me the date module and all of the other modules associated with date. So you can see that there are a lot of modules. There's also some really helpful information here. This is the module I want, but it requires another module, date API, which I have here so I can actually enable them both at the same time. There are other date modules available that are part of the date package that require other modules to work. One that we're going to be working with in the third webinar is date views. And it requires the views module in order to be enabled. Notice it's grayed out and it tells me that the views module is missing. But I'm not worried about that right now because all I need are date and date API. So I'm going to save that configuration. And now the module has been installed, it's enabled, and I can head back over to the content type under structure, manage fields, and in my list now there's some date options. So I'm going to choose one. I'll have it be a select list for the widget, how I'm going to actually enter the content, and I'll call it event date. And then save it. I want to collect an end date. It's going to use the site's time zone. The end date is not required. And these are all your choices. I can put in help text if I want. I can say, you know what, I don't want minutes, I just want hours, so you can actually specify what people can add. And I'll save that. And now, from here, if I go back over to the special event, or the sample event, and edit it, and scroll down, there's a date field here, and I can add the date and time of the event. So let's say that this event is in November 13th, 2014. I'm sorry, 2013. And it'll be at 10 in the morning. So now I've assigned a date to the event. And one thing I want to show you is that was kind of clunky. The select list option was kind of clunky, but it did add the event, or it added the date. So it is there. But if I want to refine that, I can go back to my modules and look at the date time modules, and then there's another one that I can enable called date pop-up, which actually gives me a really nice interface for adding dates to events. So I'm going to enable date pop-up, and show you the instant change that happens. And then now go back to structure, content types, go back to my event content type, and now I have this event date field. I'm going to edit that field, and I'm not actually making a change in the basic settings, but I am changing the widget type. The widget type is what the user sees when they're working with the content. So I'll go ahead and select that, and under widget type, I'm going to change it to pop-up calendar and then say continue. Now if I go back to this piece of content and edit it and scroll all the way down, notice that this field has changed, and if I click in there, it gives me a calendar and it jumps me to the current date. So it's very easy for me to actually use this as opposed to what I had before, which was that kind of daunting select list. So a much easier interface with just a simple change. The next thing to look at, we're going to skip the other fields that we were going to add, and we will try to take a look at those in another webinar, or I can answer questions about them. But the modules that were listed for those other field types are going to be in the resources, and they're very helpful modules for specifically for event type content, which is something that library programming is very important to a lot of libraries. So this will hopefully be useful for you. So definitely take a look at those resources. So under here, though, this sample event, this looks terrible. And I don't really want it to look like this, because the most important information about this event is when the event is happening. So I want that date to be right up at the top. So I'm going to go over back to this content type, and you'll see that the content type has other display, other tabs for me to control it. And one of those tabs is Manage Display. And this allows me to change the order of those fields as well as how those fields display. So I want event date to be the first thing that shows. And I'd like the label to show inline as opposed to above. If we look at this here, the label's showing here, and then the date and time shows right below it. So I want the date and time to show right next to event date. The next thing that I want showing is the image. I don't want a label on the image, and I also don't want the image to be gargantuan. This image is enormous and is messing up the entire layout of my site. So I don't want that either. So there are things called image presets, which we'll cover in the third webinar. And but there are some default presets that are available. And so I'm just going to set this to medium. And then the body and the tags, that's good. I'll put the tags, the label for the tags inline. And event contact should probably be up under event date. And I'll display that inline as well. So once I've made those choices, I can save this and then reload the event page. And automatically, this is a much more friendly display for this piece of content. The next thing that I want to look at is the teaser view, which is another display. So let's go back to the home page here. We're seeing a version of a node on the home page from the article node. Well, if I want the event content to also show, this particular event to show on the home page, I'm going to edit the event, and under publishing options, I'm going to tell it to promote to the front page, and then I'll save it. And now I'm going to reload this home page, and there's the event. But this is a really useless view of this particular event. It doesn't tell me the one thing I need to know about the event, which is when is the event. So I'll head back over to the content type and the display settings, and you'll see teaser here. I'll click on that, and then I'm going to shorten the summary, that little blurb that shows, to 200 characters so that it's not crazy long. I'm going to put the image up there because images are always nice. And I'm going to link the image to the content, so if somebody clicks on it, they'll actually get to the content. And then I'm going to put the date up there because the date is the most important thing. I'll save that. And now if I head back over to the home page here and reload, that event displays in a much more useful manner that's going to be friendly for the site and for the users. So heading back over to the slideshow, this will load in just a moment. All right, so we've installed modules. We've installed the date module in order to have the date on the event. And we've taken a look at the way that the event content type is displaying. So the content type is a custom content type that we created. It has custom fields, some of which require additional modules, some of which don't. It also has a custom display settings for the node and the teaser. And you can edit the default content types as well to have them do whatever you want. Have extra images, work in the menu, not in the menu, have stuff going on with comments, whatever it is that you want, you can make those changes or create new content types as needed. So we talked about a couple of things, a couple of words that I used. A node, which is a piece of content, and it belongs to a content type. There's usually a page that you can view a node at, or a specific URL that you can use to get to that node, but nodes can also be viewed in other ways, and when we get to the views talk in the third webinar, you'll see how you can actually set up queries that will return your nodes for you in other places. The teaser is a shortened version of the node, which you can customize so that it can be in lists of other content. Terms. This is a very important Drupal word, a term or a vocabulary or taxonomy or tags. These are organizational keywords that you can use throughout your site to create categories or metadata. And they're very helpful, and we're going to talk a lot about those in the second webinar. Module. Module in the WordPress world, module would be like a sort of a element, a feature that's kind of happening on your page. Maybe you have a module for people to provide comments or something like that. In the Drupal world, a module is a package of code that extends the functionality of your site in any way, such as module filter with the first module that we added, which just changed the way that the modules page displayed so that it was more user-friendly. There are a lot more words that are specific to Drupal, and there's a glossary page on drupal.org to help you with those. The next thing that I wanted to discuss is users and user roles, and we're almost at the hour and 30-minute mark on this webinar, and I don't want to keep you for too long. So this doesn't require too much time, and I'll try to be quick with it. Users are individuals with accounts on your site. Those accounts are tied to their email address, which is very important because it makes them accountable for what they do on your site, and it also enables them to work with their password themselves so that you don't have to give them a password or reset their password for them. They can do that if they lose their password. Their activity is tracked, so you know if they created content, if they edited content, what they did on the site. Users can also be given roles. Roles are kind of specific sets of permissions that you create. And so you can have a user who's allowed to create events and who's allowed to post to Facebook, and that's all that they're allowed to do. And you would do that by having two roles, an event creator role and a Facebook poster role, and then giving those two roles to that particular user. We'll take a look at that in a moment. User roles. You can have unlimited roles on your site, although the more you have, the more challenging your permissions page might be because you have to set permissions for every role. Users can have many roles, and if they do have many roles, they adopt the permissions for each of those rules, for each of those roles. And permissions can be further refined using another set of modules. There's a great set of modules called Workbench and its associated modules. There's also a module called Workflow. These are modules that can help you create very specific rules as to what users are able to do. So you can have users who can create content, but they can't edit content and they can't publish content. Or you can have users who can just publish content. They can't do anything else. That's entirely up to you. So quickly looking at this, heading back over to the demo. I apologize, I'm going to take a sip. All right, so we're going to look at the demo site. We're not going to do this on our raw site because I want to speed this up a little bit. So looking at the demo site, under the People tab, I have two users. I have Rain, which is me, the user one that I created initially, and then I have a user named Annie. And Annie has a role called Event Coordinator. I can create a new user by clicking Add User, and I'll call this one John, and then give John a password. And then I will determine whether or not this user is going to have specific roles. Maybe I want this user to also be an event coordinator. And then I'll go ahead and create that account. So now there's an account for John as well in this list of users. I can see the last time the user logged in, and in the logs it'll tell me what the user has actually been doing. If I look at permissions and then click over to roles here, I can see the default roles: anonymous, authenticated, and administrator. These are the default user roles that are part of Drupal when you install it. Event coordinator is one that I created for people who are going to post events. And I can add a new role now if I want. We'll call this article access. It can be whatever you want. It can be, children's librarian. And then that person can have access only to content that is tagged as being children's content. So it's very flexible what you can do with your user roles. So I've just created a new user role. If I go back to the list and edit John, I can add that role to his account if I want to. The other thing that I can do is, let's say I don't want John to access the site anymore. Rather than delete him, because then it would remove all record of his activity on the site, so I don't want to do that. What I can do is block him. If he's blocked, he can no longer log into the site. All of his activity is stored. I have that record and I can access it whenever I want to, but he can't access the site anymore. So that's very easy to do as well. So Annie is an event coordinator. And if we look at permissions, I'm going to scroll down here. You'll see administrator can do pretty much anything. Event coordinator is right next to administrator. If I scroll down, there's not a lot that event coordinator can do until, or any reason that that person exists, until you get down to this section. It says event, create, edit, delete. There's own and any content. So content that the event coordinator created or content that other people created. She can do anything as long as it's event content. So she has permissions to use that content. So now I'm going to head over to Firefox, where I'm logged into the demo site as Annie. And I don't have the bar at the top because I can't do anything in the site. I do have a logout link, and I have navigation to add content. If I click on add content, I immediately get the create event form because the only thing I can do is create events. So if I'm adding content, then presumably I'm adding an event, since that's the only thing I can do. So I can go ahead and add events in here and then save it. Or if I go to some of the other pages on the site, if I go to the About Us page, I can't edit it. Let's go back over to Chrome here and we'll take a look at the About page. I have this View and Edit tab, so I can edit it straight from the page. But because I don't have permission for basic pages, I can't edit this. But if I go back home, actually the event, if there were an event, I would be able to edit the event that already existed. But there's not currently a published event, so I can't edit that event because I don't have access. So that's basically user roles. Pretty straightforward. And almost the conclusion of this first webinar. I'm going to go back to the slideshow for just a quick recap of a couple of slides. And then we can wrap up. Give me a moment here while this loads. All right. So users are individuals with login credentials on the site. A role is a set of permissions that can be applied to a user. Users can have multiple roles. A permission is a tool for controlling the access that the user has to pretty much anything on your site: content creation, modification of the site administration. User one, this is something that we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar when I was installing. I said this first person that you create is user one. This is a very important person. It's also known as the site maintenance account. As the first user, this person can do anything on your site, which includes, add PHP into your site. If that PHP is broken, your site is broken. And it's very hard to fix something that's been added as content into the site. So you don't want really people to be working with your site, even yourself, because you don't want to have an accident as the user one, as a super user. So you don't want that. So always create an account for yourself, an administrative account for yourself after you set up your site, rather than working as user one. When you first install Drupal, you have 3 default roles: administrator, which is a default Drupal role that has high-level permissions on the site. You can still control those permissions, so an administrator might not be able to do certain things, and that's up to you to decide what level of access the administrator is going to have. Authenticated user, which is any site visitor that has logged in using credentials to your site. And the anonymous user, which is the public, somebody who's not logged into your site. So your library patrons, parents of kids that are in programming, those would probably be anonymous users unless you've actually given them credentials so that they become authenticated users. And they're only authenticated when they're logged in. Otherwise, even if they do have accounts, then they are anonymous. And that is everything. I hope I got it into an hour and 30 minutes. And so there might be questions. I know that most people are going to be watching this after the fact, so we won't be going over questions right now. However, if you do have questions, there's this URL, which is also in the resource packet that will be available as a download from the webinar. This URL has all of the resources linked off, and then it also has a space for comments at the end. And I will be checking this throughout the course of these 3 webinars. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and post the questions as a comment on this URL, on this page. And then I might fold the response into a future webinar, or I might just respond on the post itself, depending on what the question is. Thank you very much for spending this time with me, and I look forward to the future webinars with you, which will cover a lot of the things that we glossed over: taxonomy, more about taxonomy. We discussed views, how to make your site look like your site as opposed to that default blue site that with that river of news on the front page. And the next webinar is on December 10th. It's at 3 p.m. and the link to the webinar has been posted by Ted on the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rain. That was terrific. I don't think I've ever heard Drupal explained quite so well. So we will be sure to pass that on to the IT staff, primarily from academic libraries, but also some of the public libraries who had registered for this, so that they can also register and hopefully attend live at the next one once they see how complete the orientation is. I think they'll be very interested in doing that. So again, as Rain said, the next webinar is December 10th, and then we will also have the 3rd webinar on January 10th, also at 3 p.m. And please register for both of those at the TLA CE site. Thanks a lot, and we'll be posting the recording very soon. And Rain, we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.